So we're going to start with chapter 5, compounds and their bonds. In this chapter, we will discuss all these topics. What I'm going to do is break each one. This is going to be section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And I will have a video for each one of these sections. This is the first section. Chapter 5.1, we're talking about ions. Ions are formed when we transfer electrons. Atoms are going to react. Atoms want to form octets. And the reason for that is that they want to become more stable. How are they going to have an octet? What is an octet? An octet means having 8 electrons in the last shell. How do we do it? They are going to lose, they are going to gain, or they are going to share electrons. Which electrons? The last electrons, the ones that are the valence electrons. By doing this, they are going to form what is called ionic or covalent bonds. Ionic bonds will be discussed first, and then covalent bonds will be discussed more later on in the chapter. The octet rule is defined as the tendency of atoms to share or transfer electrons to have a more stable configuration. If you look at the periodic table, all the noble gases, except for helium, they have 8 electrons in the last shell. So all the atoms in the periodic table want to have 8 electrons to have a very stable configuration. So if they transfer the electrons, and by this I mean somebody loses it and somebody gains the electrons, then they form what is called an ionic bond. And if they share the electrons, then they form what is called a covalent bond. Again, looking at this, we see all the noble gases, they have, with the exception of helium, they all have 8 electrons in the last shell. 2 in the S and 6 in the P. So in the behavior of the atoms is the following. Metals are going to form positive ions, and these positive ions are called cations. How do they form the cations? They are going to form them by losing valence electrons, all the valence electrons. So for example, group elements from group 1 are going to form cations with a +1 charge. Group 2, a +2 charge, and group 3, that's only for aluminum because it's the only metal, it will form a +3 charge. So metals will lose the electrons to form cations. For example, sodium. When we look at sodium, sodium has 11 protons and 11 electrons. So if sodium loses 1 electron, then the number of protons remains the same, and then the number of electrons goes to 10. And the charge of sodium now will be +1. So let's take a look of this, and by placing it in the periodic table, we could see what will be the number of valence electrons for aluminum. Well, aluminum is in group 3A, so it will have 3 electrons in the last shell. What does aluminum require for to acquire an octet? Well, because it has 3 electrons and aluminum is a metal, therefore is going to lose these 3 electrons. What is the charge of aluminum ions? Because it's going to lose 3 electrons, the charge will be 3+, and the symbol will be aluminum with a 3+ charge. This over here should be upper script. So we just discussed cations. Let's talk about now anions. How do we form anions? Well, the non-metals are the ones that form anions. And they do it again to complete their octet. How do they form the anions? By gaining the electrons. So for example, chlorine has 17 protons and 17 electrons when it's neutral. Because it's a non-metal, it's going to gain electrons. And in order to have 8 electrons in the outermost shell, it's going to have 18 electrons. And the charge of chlorine is going to be -1. So depending on where these elements are in the periodic table, we can predict the charges. If they are in group 1, they are going to have +1, group 2 +2, aluminum will be +3, halogens, or this group will be -1, oxygen and sulfur -2, nitrogen and phosphorus -3. So what is the group number for sulfur? Well, sulfur is in the same group as oxygen, so the answer will be this one. What is the number of valence electrons that sulfur has? Because it's in group 6A, it will have 6 electrons. To acquire an octet, what does it require? Well, because it's a non-metal, it will need to gain 2 electrons. And what is the charge then? Because it gained 2 electrons, the charge will be -2.